My predecessor at Gibson, he was the one to really kind of break it down for me and said, "You have a relationship problem. And I know you care about people. I know how much you care, but they don't know you. And you're going to have to, slow down and figure this out." And he's like, "Do you want to actually be CEO or you just want to have the title?"
Leadership roles, great and small, come with a choice. We have to decide which route we are going to take. Are we more interested in A, having the title of being called leader, or B, actually bearing the responsibilities and burdens of leading? I'm your host, Tim Spiker, and this is the Be Worth Following podcast, a production of the People Forward Network. On this show, we talk with exceptional leaders, thinkers, and researchers about what actually drives effective leadership across the globe and over time. You just heard from Tim Leman, the CEO and chairman of Gibson. Gibson is an employee-owned insurance, risk, and benefits advisory that has been around for almost 100 years, and today they sit in the top 1% of independent insurance brokers in the United States. When Tim first became CEO, he realized that he didn't have the relationships that he needed with those that he was leading. And this was an especially tough realization because for his career, Tim had been a person focused on developing great relationships. In the midst of this realization, his predecessor asked him, "Do you want to be CEO or do you just want the title?" That moment shifted Tim to a new perspective, one that caused him to take full ownership for anything that wasn't working well under his watch, including relationships. Today, Tim continues to work not only on the organization, but on developing himself as a leader and as a person. His dedication and perseverance didn't begin later in life. It was with him from the very beginning.
So I'm married to my high school sweetheart, Kimra. She was the first one that would say yes to me to go on the date. But the real part of the story is, and we'd off for a little while and then reconnected in college. We actually got engaged while we were in school. She was a year behind me, and we graduated on one Saturday, and I think we got married the next Saturday, and had a honeymoon. The next Monday, I started a Fortune 500 sales job in Indianapolis. So leading up to that, I kind of figured out that I really enjoyed people, sales, incentive-based compensation, all those kind of things. And I also was going to be supporting my spouse, and she had a year of school left and all these things. And I worked in the business school office at Indiana State where I went. And so I was involved with a lot of the recruiters and things. And I started realizing that I didn't want all the same jobs that most of the kids were getting. I wanted to get into sales and I needed to make some money immediately. So I got out the Indianapolis Business Journal book of lists and I started writing letters. There's top 25 insurance brokers. And I wrote them all a letter, told them I was a really swell guy. I'd accomplished a lot of things and I thought I would really help them out. Most of them never responded. I followed up and called every one of them. And I wrote down very specific notes and I still have them. A lot of these are our competitors today. And basically, they told me to pound sand. And out of the 25, there were only two of them that said they would take a chance on me. And one of them was kind of forced. And that's because they did all the university's insurance programs. And Indiana State's a unique place that has a risk management program. And so they basically, his name is John Boss. And they're like, "Hey, John, you've never hired one of our graduates. We got this program. We pay you a lot of money. This is a really good year." And I'd gone to the provost to ask him to help leverage that relationship for me. So we got going. John hired me and learned so much from him about the business world, really working with clients and all kinds of things, just a lot of little quips and lifeisms and everything. And I think the thing I realized it's now become a thing. Everybody talks about stories and how important it is to capture everything in stories. And John is just kind of larger than life when he's around people. And so he was probably the best account executive of anybody I've ever been with. Like his clients loved his stories. He was able to take really challenging situations and break them all down into simple pieces. They felt like he always had their back. And as complex as something like all this, health insurance and self-funded health plans and crazy forecasting and all that, John made it simple for all of his clients. And they just loved him. So I loved spending time with him so much that I just really begged him to go along with him on his client meetings because I wanted to, learn how he did it and what he did. So I would actually drive 30 minutes north to his home to be able to get in the car with him to drive an hour back, south, so that I could have maximize my time versus I probably should have just met him on the edge of the highway and been in the car with him for about 10 minutes. But it was how I could get all this extra time and learn from him. And even though half the time we were in the car, he was taking phone calls, how he did things, how he negotiated, how he worked his way through things. I mean, really my entire career in terms of work when I was working closely with clients, I think I modeled it every day on that. So just a great guy. And when it came time for my wife and I, a couple years into it, realized that we wanted to do something different and live somewhere else and experience new things. As much as he had put a lot into me and trained me and didn't expect me to probably ever leave, he was the biggest fan in my corner, made calls, supported me 100%. And I, also tried to learn from that along the way too, of how to graciously take somebody that you have high expectations for and they need to move on and fly the coop from you and support them the way John did for me.
When we look at the statistics around who really great leaders are, 77% of that person's effectiveness comes from who they are. In other words, are they an inwardly sound and others focused leader? And when you talk about, especially that last piece, others focused, what happens when somebody says, hey, I need to move on? Do you regret your investment in them, or do you cheer them on and help them take that next step? And it's not necessarily about you. I remember as we were going through the docu-series, The Last Dance came out about the Chicago Bulls. And early on, they were talking about Michael Jordan and his time at North Carolina. And, it wasn't common at that point that people would skip any years of college to go play in the NBA. That was extremely uncommon. And after Michael Jordan's junior year, he wanted to come back to North Carolina. But Dean Smith, one of the all-time greatest coaches and certainly an others-focused leader, said, you know what, probably time for you to go to the NBA. And you think about what a generational talent Michael Jordan was. What does it take for somebody to say, it might be in my best short-term interest that you be here, but it's in your long-term best interest that you go, so let me help you? I just hear that in the story as you're talking about John. Do you remember what his initial reaction was when you said, hey, I think I need to move on?
I knew I needed to see him. It was like Memorial Day weekend and called, said, hey, I need to drive up, see you. And okay. And I get in the car and start going. I'm kind of scared and shaking. And his wife calls me like 2 minutes later and she's like, what are you doing? Are you quitting? She just knew. And I'm like, I just need to talk with John. And he totally got it. And he's like, well, so what are you thinking? I laid out some of the cities we were looking at. And like, well, those are all pretty fun and the weather's great. And he's like, I know you're frustrated with our company a little bit on a corporate level, and they weren't probably taking care of me as well as they should. He was doing everything in his power to help me with some of that. He said, but if you'd consider, Phoenix was one of the cities and it's ultimately where we moved to, he said, I'll call my counterpart out there and tell him you're willing to do it. And I said, yeah, sure. Why not? And it was a replay of back in the college. That guy said, I don't hire green behind the ear rookies, John. So, have him look me up after he gets a little more experience out here. And that was awesome. It was great fuel. We did well out in Phoenix against him, but I'll tell you, and I don't think it matters anymore at this point in time, but as an example, our company corporately John had promised me that I would make X amount of dollars, and corporate had me plugged in the system at some other job or role. And they're, it's kind of very bureaucratic. And they're like, well, we're not paying him. And he's like, well, he's performed, he sold, I promised him. So John's like, hey, I struck out, man, but I told you this is the deal. So I'm going to get it to you, but here's the deal that we're going to have to do. The next 7 employees that we hire, I'm going to tell corporate that you referred them all to us. And that's, $1,500 an employee. And then I have this other good housekeeping seal of approval bonus I can give once a year. And anyway, I don't know, he pieced together probably like 7 little things like that was kind of funny and kind of rogue. And he probably could have gotten in some trouble with that. But he was like, hey, I told you. And so I'm going to come through for you.
I can think specifically a time in my career when somebody made a very significant promise and then came back to me and said, my hands are tied, I can't. And they had creative means, like John showed up. I actually had the opposite experience. I had somebody who said it was going to and then used what others said as an excuse for not coming through. And I'm 50 years old. That was a long time ago. And I don't mean that I'm holding a grudge, but I still remember that happened. And you still remember what happened to you. We just have the opposite stories. How important that integrity is to say, okay, corporate wouldn't play along with me the way that, but I made the promise. And so I'm going to figure out some way to make it happen. I love that. I love that. And here's what's funny about that, Tim. If you were to introduce me to John right now, I would trust him more because of what he did for you. Before we move on to some of the things that you're doing now, I do want to go back to one other part of your, we'll just, for the sake of treating it like a movie, we'll call it your origin story. Just for everybody's reminder, they heard it in the opening already, but your current title is what?
I'm the CEO and chairman at Gibson, and we're a regional insurance broker. So we've got 4 offices in the Midwest and then expanded out to the Mountain States about a year ago. So we're in Phoenix now. And I spent about 6 years out there. So that's been fun reconnecting with old relationships and getting things moving and off the ground out there.
So I want to point out CEO and chairman. I just want everybody to notice how your story started out. I sent out how many letters and was told to go pound sand. And somebody said, even though you've done it, you're too green. I think it's such a tough time right now for younger, aspiring leaders, because while the world is offering things at a faster pace than it ever has, there still are some things that are going to take some measure of time. And we could easily look at you and think, oh, everything must have been easy for Tim from the beginning. And that's not the story of any leader that I've ever met, but I think your story perfectly shows that, look, when you were getting done with college and you're trying to find a job, you're pounding the pavement. And then once you get the job, you're working your tail off. Say a little bit about some of those early years and what that looked like in terms of getting started, because it doesn't sound like, oh yeah, that was easy.
I think I've learned about myself. I'm good at observing, watching, mimicking, and then trying to put my own spin on it. And I guess that probably intuitively came to me even back then. So when I got that first role, I spent a lot of time, I'll say, with the older guys, and I invested the time to spend time with them on their terms. So our building, there was a bar on the first floor, and I got an awesome wife and I'm newly married. I'd frankly just as soon rather have been home with her right after work. But these guys would go down and play pool or hang out for an hour, and they would allow me to, very gracious of them, to buy them drinks. And they'd harass me in a playful kind of way. But those kind of relationships back then, even just sitting and hearing them talk and tell stories and asking them things, and also measuring against what they said versus what they were really doing. And then I'd circle it back to, I'm in the car with John, who was their boss as well. And I didn't tell John what they said, and I never told them what John said, but I heard a lot of sides of all the same things. I heard why the sales goal wasn't met, and why it was things that out of their control, and I got a completely different perspective from John. And they're both right, and at the same time too. And so some of those kind of things really helped me know what I wanted to do and how to do it and so on. And also just, it probably speaks to my kind of my love language and all that, of the acts of service. And so when they would then do something for me, intro me to somebody or whatever, I mean, it meant the world to me, and I never forgot it. And so I would always try to do anything I could to help them. I think what set me apart, though, was they were used to a lot of other young people at the time who didn't seem to care as much as I did, or weren't as passionate, had excuses of why they wouldn't come down to the bar and have a beer with them after work. And I knew that it wasn't about the beer. It wasn't about whether I was really wanted to go have a beer at a lousy bar in an office building, at 5 o'clock. That's not what the question that was being asked. And that's not what the event was. The event was, I get prime time with accomplished professional veterans who are awesome, and I can learn something from them. And that's how I always viewed it.
All right. So let's move forward. CEO and chairman. But in addition to that, you've got a podcast, you've written a book. Talk a little bit about how some of those activities outside of your day-to-day responsibilities of leading the organization, but you continue to grow, is the word I would use. Apparently, your development didn't end when you became CEO, it looks like.
Oh, man, I think it started all over again when I became CEO. And I really, really struggled. People land in that CEO chair. Some come through finance, some through operations, and some through sales. And I think the trend over the years, more and more and more, is people are coming more out of finance and so on. big companies want compliance and governance, and all these things are really, really critical. And I'm just a sales jockey. And so I didn't know myself as well back then. I knew things about myself, and I've really learned a lot more and spent a lot of time studying it. But coming out of that sales environment was really great. I'm a people person. I don't have to fake that. I'm always interested in them. But I'm also have a really high need for achievement. And so I like doing lots of stuff. So I tend to have really strong relationships with anybody that I'm kind of shoulder to shoulder with in the trenches. So when I was personally selling, my service team members, because I spent a lot of time with them, we were in the car together, we'd go places. And then as my career evolved out in Phoenix and then coming back to Indiana and even moving into the CEO role, I was in more of a player coach role. And even then, though, I was touching more people, more things, but as long as it was close, it all happened naturally for me. And I built up a lot of trust that I didn't know or realize. It just happened, and it was happening by our interactions together. When I got in that CEO chair, I had only touched in sales about half of our employees, maybe a third. And so I come into the CEO side of things, and I really didn't have any kind of relationship. And immediately I just got just stuck, and people didn't trust me. In fact, all my natural gifts and skills, I'm a galvanizer. I can rally people, persuade. And it's because I believe everything I'm ever persuading anybody into. It's all authentic. But those things were turned into problems. So the people who didn't know me well just said, he sounds so perfect and so wonderful every time he says stuff that I don't believe a single word of it because it can't be as good as he thinks it is. So something that just came naturally, I'd relied on as my one of my secret powers, I guess, or whatever, was actually working against me. It's like, man, how do I come in and, throw my presentation, make it worse and not practice or not be ready, right? And so it was really, really frustrating. And I couldn't figure all that stuff out. It was my predecessor at Gibson. He was the one to really kind of break it down for me and said, you have a relationship problem. And I know you care about people. I know how much you care. I know all those sort of things, but they don't know you. And you're going to have to, slow down and figure this out. I was just banging my head against the wall with some of our key managers who just did not trust me. And he's like, you're right in all these situations. So congrats. You and I having this conversation. Yes, you win the technical arguments, but who cares? You got to be the adult here. And, do you want to actually be CEO or you just want to have the title? So you've got to own this, and it's your responsibility to figure this out, to go spend time with them, to meet them on their level and help them get to know you. And I guess that should have been more obvious, but it wasn't. And once that kind of clicked and I was able to realize where those relationships had been built organically without even trying, I had to be a lot more intentional about it going forward. And everything really started changing after that. The book was one part therapy because I screwed up so many things, still do, but with less frequency. It's called, it's spelled like revolution, but our evolution. And it really just, some of it was some of it was revolutionary change and some of it was evolutionary change. But I just started had a coach friend who had written a book and I'd been writing blogs and so on. And he's like, Tim, you could write like an ebook, and this is, I don't know, 10 years ago, 8 years ago. He's like, it's really just a series of blogs and I'll help you if you want. And it's not that hard. So started doing this and I realized how much the learning that had occurred, but also, I needed a little bit of a time to clear my head because some of it was really painful and personal and it hurt and getting some of the feedback. So we put it together for that reason. We also put it together because we're a nearly 90-year-old company and we almost lost it. We're really kind of redlining and would have need to have sold the company and a whole lot of change would have happened coming out of that. And so I wanted us to never forget, and really for myself too, some of those lessons that we learned that kept us not only in business, but we took off and just grew like crazy and thrived so that we knew and reminded ourselves of what that took. It was also a good accountability partner for me because by putting myself out there and expressing the mistakes, but also now I didn't get the advantage of saying I wasn't aware. Now I was fully aware of how to do it better. I had to live up to the guy in the book, and it's out there and it's public and my record's there. And so people can call me on it. And then the bonus thing that it turned into, though, is it's been really, really useful from a recruiting standpoint and some of our executive roles and so on we brought on because if we're in a kind of a tight battle with somebody, I'll usually try to send it home to the spouse actually. And it's not long after that that the candidate's saying, "Hey, my spouse said I need to take this job." So it's actually been great on that end of things. I don't think any of my junior high or high school English teachers would have picked me from my high school class to have a book with the Library of Congress number, but I do. So
That's very good. Well, I mean, there's something to writing, and I would say this to anybody who's listening, not just somebody who wants to publish a book, but there's the journaling concept, which is I'm just getting my ideas out, and that is like step one of making sense of what we're thinking. If you happen to share some of that writing with somebody else, I would call that step two, because usually kind of that stream of consciousness isn't quite exactly where we want to land. We want to give it a little more structure. And so if you were to share some of those journaling efforts with somebody, which frankly is something that we often ask our clients to do for this very reason, it takes them to a different level of learning. Then you went the third step and said, okay, now I'm going to actually publish it and put it out there. But the act of authorship, and again, you don't have to get something published to do this. Even as you write privately, it is very often a crucible type of activity where you can clarify things for yourself just through the act of writing.
well, yeah, and you've been through this. It really turned out to be a great experience. I felt so fortunate along the way too because I had people help connect me to what I'll call some real authors with real books who took a look at the draft and everything. And one wrote my intro for me. Tim, the coolest thing that I got though, and not because I know him, but Pat Lencioni actually endorsed my book. And again, one of those kind of random cool stories. I had a friend who knew him really well, so I thought, what better than get Pat Lencioni to endorse your book? So there's no chance of it. We kept checking in with his assistant or GM or whatever. I guess she's the general manager. And all of a sudden, like right before I couldn't wait any longer, it was like in December of that, like 2015, I think when it got published, she goes, I don't know what it is about random Tuesdays at 8:30, but he has a stack of like 50 people that want him to write something, a blurb about his book. And out of the stack, he grabbed yours and here's his endorsement and paragraph. Will this work for you?
I don't even care what it says at that point. No matter
I don't
if
care
he had
what it
said
says.
this is the worst book ever, just we'll put it on the book. Thank you.
So it was pretty cool and long story longer, but our YPO group is going to bring Pat to Indianapolis in 2023 to speak, a big event. And we wanted to see if anybody had connection with him. So I actually went back to the old email and connected with him, and he's on the docket for next year to speak to all of us. So, like, remember that guy you wrote that little 3 sentences for? It meant a lot to him. Would you come speak to our group?
So Rick Packer, who was our second guest ever on this podcast, Rick and I were trading some messages a week and a half ago, and he was talking about Pat and everything that they're doing with Working Genius, and the numbers are just staggering in terms of the number of books they've sold in such a short period of time. You said galvanizing a second ago. I'm like, I bet I know where that came from.
You know where I got that from? The Working Genius stuff. We've used Colby here for years and a lot more like science behind it and all that. And there's not on the Working Genius, but I tell you, like our people like love it because it's really easy to understand and it just makes so much sense. But I love talking to that table group consultant. I was like, okay, all right, got the 6 of these here. And my need for achievement, I actually don't want to be downgraded in some of these. Like I want to have 4 things that I'm a genius in because I am. Is like I said, so okay, I get it, the genius part. What do you do with the middle ones and what do you do with the bottom ones? And he said, well, you ignore the middle and then you just stay the heck out of all the bottom ones. So just spend all your time doing your top 2, your genius ones, and that's it. I'm like, that's that simple. And the more you can spend time in those areas of strength and things that just so natural, it just doesn't feel like work and you're so good at it. And if you can avoid those things, the frustration, the stuff that brings you, gridlock, I think the hard thing to do, and this is part of being chairman and CEO, I am lucky though, because I do get to now really design my role and my days and my weeks around what fits and gives me energy. And that's not something that everybody in every role can do all the time, but they can start moving in that direction. I've also learned too that I think trying to fix all the things you're not great at is not, I don't believe is a good use of time. but it's really important to be cognizant of them. And then even all these things that these working genius strengths or whatever assessment you might use, like anything else, when too much of it or too often or not done with based on the right, whether it's morals, ethics, or caring about people, whatever, can be really bad too. So, in Colby language, I'm a quick start, and quick starts can be great. I can launch projects quickly. The other thing is that somebody like me, I can just absolutely wear people out because it's always something new, and there's always a way to make it just a little bit better. Boy, it just overwhelms people. And I realize more a lot now, like with my family and everything too, in my leadership team, I have to slow down and stop and or give them time to process because it's not fair to them because I'm a quick start and then I have a strong communication skills, which I think I've always had, but writing a book makes you a better speaker, and the more you read, you write better, and all those kind of things come together. And then I really do think about a lot of things before I even put out in front of everybody. I have a fast processor. So it would appear to a lot of people I don't spend any time researching or thinking about things, but I do. It just happens really, really fast. So I put everybody at a terrible disadvantage because I can pitch my idea better. I've probably thought about it faster, quicker, longer, and I've introduced it. And then they just get overwhelmed and they don't get a chance to collaborate and be a part of it. And boy, there's nothing intentional about that. I don't mean to do that. I have zero interest. In fact, I don't want to be right. I want to get it right. I think, Brene Brown talks about that, but I come across that it's my idea or not. And so there's those things along the way that I've had to learn. The other side of some of these gifts and skills we all have can be actually just cause a lot of harm.
They all have a shadow. I had a really close friend of mine. He said, "Hey, Tim, when you think of solutions and you bring them to me, can you please bring them at 80%?"
Yeah.
And I understood what he was saying because I think very similar to you, I was doing all the math, and I was coming to what I believed was the best conclusion. And I wanted to get it right. I didn't want to be right. But in the midst of pursuing that, I didn't do a great job of leaving open the space for somebody else who might need to make a contribution. Just leave it open a little bit. And he told me that probably 4 or 5 years ago. It was such a blessing that he told me that. And so anyway, as you're telling that story, I feel like, oh man, not only is our first name the same, but there are some other things that are the same as well here. I feel like it can really relate to what you're talking about.
I like that concept though, Tim. Yeah. It only needs to be about 80% baked. And that's a really good start. And that leaves it open for everybody. That's a good way to remember and think about it.
There's another thing that you do with your team that I would like people to get a chance to hear about, which is this idea of the leadership path in terms of kind of how you set that each year with your team. Tell us a little bit about what you do and what that looks like for your team.
We put together really a theme every year for the company that we communicate, we spend time on, we spend some learning and so on. And I really enjoy it because it's part of that growth learning. It gives me a reason to basically assigning myself a little bit of a college term paper, and I've got to go study up and read some things. And so when we get together and try to have a really inclusive process on that, talking with the leadership team and others about what are some things as a company that maybe we're slipping a little bit on, or maybe we got some big challenges coming up and we need to kind of think about certain topics or whatever. And so I get to dig in then and personalize that and usually help set the course for the year and then deliver some of those too, which is kind of fun. And what we've been working on now and transitioning, and this year will be one of the first that I'm going to put a little less into it, and other people are going to put a little bit more into it, even down to a few months ago, a couple of the key people on final on this. I realized that I needed to be outvoted on this, and we weren't really far apart, but they're a little different direction on the theme. And we're going with what the two of them think is what we really need. And it's good. It's going to be a little bit challenging too, because it's something I'm passionate about. And we're talking about just being better together. We do a lot of collaborative relationships with peer businesses and form joint ventures and a lot of things like that to be creative together. We're in a peer group that we share lots of information. So it's actually a great one. This is good for me because it needs to be like this, because as we keep growing and as time goes on, I might be the spiritual leader a little bit still always in that kind of role, but spreading it out and making it part of more than just me, I think is really good. So it's going to challenge me here in the upcoming months as we put some of those things together to use my skills to help pitch somebody else's idea a little bit, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, co-creation creates ownership. And then you add into that maybe even a step beyond co-creation. We're going to co-create, and when it comes down to the tiebreaker, I'm going to step back. I'm going to exercise a little humility. I'm going to yield. We're going to use your emphasis and wording and not mine. All of these things are the types of things that create connection and buy-in for the people that we're leading. And of course, you'll tell them if you feel like it's going off a cliff, but I'm sure that's not the case.
Tim, it's been neat though, because, 5 years ago, if I wrote out all 12 monthly lessons, 100%. And what's really been neat though is that because we do a lot of blogging, we do some type of a leadership blog pops out once a week and so on. But even over the last couple of years, we've been transitioning. I might have really set the kind of the guidelines, but it's been so cool hearing some of our people's stories of leadership that they have. And I always tell that everybody's got one blog in them. So you get a lot of people there. We were talking about writing and all that. They're afraid of it and all that. Everybody's got at least one story of 1,000 words. It's two pages of Word document. And don't be intimidated by it. Just like, what would you say if you were talking to somebody? That's how I write. I write how I would talk to them. But it's so cool to see them take off and run with this. And then some people kind of get the bug after that too. I feel really fortunate to have mediums like LinkedIn and so on, because I get a chance to talk to my people all the time. And we're in 5 offices in 3 different states. And I spend a lot of time putting a lot of stuff that some people might think is personal out there. I try to draw some leadership lessons from it. I talk about my kids a lot, but it might be the one way for them to know what's going on with me or how they feel about me as the leader. But it's also, I realized over the years that, again, you write this and you become it, and you become it after you write it. And it forces me to always be that person that I am out there. And I focus a lot of time on my family and all these other things. So it's how I've had to learn to communicate with limited time and can't get to everybody anymore, can't see everybody in person, is to just share my stories out there. And it's really interesting. I don't always know what's going on in all of their lives personally, and I wish I did. But when I bump into people I haven't seen in 6 months or something in person, I can just tell in talking with them, they feel like we've been talking. We're talking every month because I'm reading something that you wrote that was personal.
Talk a little bit about how you see the relationship between effective communication and having trusting relationships with your team.
Communication is everything. And I feel really blessed. That's something that comes fairly naturally to me. But I also spent a lot of time working on it. But I realize how absolutely critical it is, 'cause most people hate surprises, unless it's like a birthday present, right? Surprises are bad. So they want to know. They want to know it as quickly as you know it. They want to know everything you know about it. It needs to be simple. It needs to be easy to read, because anybody looking at it's going to skim it quickly. So all of those things, and I guess I didn't plan it to be this way, but after spending a lot of time writing now over the last, say, 10 years, it just comes naturally. Like, if I have a really important email sent to the company, I'm going to bold probably one of the sentences in the paragraph. I'm going to try to get it into a couple of bite-sized pieces. I'll probably kind of summarize it right at the top and hit it again at the bottom, and then offer an opportunity to talk in person or whatever, and try to make it really simple. People on the phone are going to see it the way they want to read it. People that are looking on a desktop, and then also try to do some of the same sort of things, put some video stuff out if we need to. And I think it's an area that a lot of executives don't do well. And this is where I'm glad I may not have been able to read a balance sheet as well as somebody else, but coming out of being the sales jockey world, to perform well in that, you have to have some communication skills and persuasion skills and those type of things. And feel fortunate to have had that sort of background, because I know a lot of people internally, it takes them a long time. My COO might take him 3 hours for him to write a really important email for the company that I can probably get done in 18 minutes. And that's looking over it twice and fixing a couple things and popping it out.
I have a goal, and I will have failed this year if I don't achieve it. But one of my goals this year is for my 13-year-old and I to read together The Gap in the Gain. I look at him and I see, in many ways, it's a mini-me situation. And I have very perfectionistic tendencies. And perfectionism can drive us, but it can also ruin us. It can also ruin our relationships. It can also make us terrible leaders.
Tim, you'll appreciate this. So I think, like you said, we have a lot of similarities. We probably diverge in a couple of these. So I have high standards, but I'm not a perfectionist. I would always look at my buddies, at Indiana State was a great place to go to college because just for A's, not for B's or anything, but in A's, there was only a single A category. And it was either 90% up to 100. And so I always was disappointed in myself if I got more than about a 92. My buddy next to me got a 98 because it means I didn't spend enough
What a
time.
waste of effort to get a 98.
What a waste of effort. But the other part of the perfectionism, when we talk about, people and outwardly focused, as my predecessor did for me here, we've got somebody, I'm 48, he's 34, that we see as my predecessor. He joined us right out of college, just an incredible guy. And I'm just going to say his name, David, here, and hopefully he'll listen to this and I'll embarrass him all over again one more time. But I had some people that really helped me a lot when I was that age, and this is his Achilles heel. And he's actually tamed his perfectionism in an incredible way. We went to dinner with him and his wife, as we do from time to time, and I had in my head, and my wife was just mortified and she kept begging me not to do it. I told her I was going to, but I said, Sarah's going to appreciate this, I think. But I had calculated in my head quickly the amount of money and economic value that he was going to leave on the table for their family over a 10-year period because of his perfectionism. Because in our business, as you build a book of clientele, it was going to keep him from having as large of a book as his talent should. He's truly like one of a kind. And his perfectionism was killing him, and it was killing his relationships. And so, shoot, he was probably 26 or 7 at this point in time. So I launch in on him at dinner. And I'd always tell him about this, but I was going to do it in front of her some night. And I was playful about it, but it was substantial economic impact. And I believe, it's real. And she's like, "Oh my gosh, no kidding. He's horrible about this." It was all I had to say. And I don't know if it was necessarily because I actually put some numbers around it, but it was that really big turning point of like, man, it's okay to get the 91% and it's still an A. And what you do is you're so good at it. You do it so well. You could impact so many more clients who your 92% is like 50% better than the next best person. You're a volume player. And if you don't actually get out there and touch a lot more people, you're wasting all this talent that you have and all that stuff. And he's learned and taken, he's done really, really well with it because there was a while there, I just wasn't sure if that was going to come together.
Wow, that's a super fun story and really valuable. It actually leads into the last thing that I want to make sure we touch on. Talk a little bit more about the structure of how you intend. You look at the organization, we've got leaders to do what we're doing now, but we need to continue to evolve. We need to continue to grow. No organization is fully equipped for the leadership it's going to need tomorrow because we all have growth ideas, either in volume or sophistication or both. So talk a little bit about your overall system and thinking around leadership development within the organization.
Tim, that's an area where we've got to get better than we are. I think we do some things really well and some other things okay. And then some other areas we aren't doing as well as we need to. We start like the assessments are really important, and we try to not have that be something around hiring. It's an ongoing thing, a learning from thing, and a sharing thing. So one of our members of our HR team is Colby certified. And because we're a big EOS shop and for some other reasons, Colby just really makes sense for us. It's in alignment with, some strategic partners and that type of thing. And then I think, again, some of this theme stuff that we do and this learning and everything, it's out there. And so we have a kind of an intentional, informal leadership development process with that. We've also put this into Lessonly now so we can keep all these things and going and so on. I think we've done a good job, maybe too good a job, and probably can't take credit for it. It's probably more of a by circumstances, but we've thrust people into roles that were probably a shoe size or two too big. And it's because we're moving so fast, growth happens. There's been a lot of great things that have happened because of that, and you find people can rise to the occasion. And then other times, though, I feel bad because I think we've thrust people into some roles that they weren't ready for yet. And there's a difference between being able to rise to the occasion, put the attitude and effort in place to learn and get it done, and also just leaving them out to dry or not giving them some of the coaching and that type of stuff that they need. So I'm actually kind of at a spot right now. Like, I know everyone here knows it's important, knows we care about it, and we have a lot of coaching and some other things that we bring professionals in to help with our people. But I love when I was listening to your podcast with Mark Miller from Chick-fil-A, and we talk about an organization that's just killed it in this area. And it sits there, I feel envious of it. And I'm get myself in one of those quandaries of, well, yeah, but I don't know if we can slow down and do it. And can we afford to do it? And we got to invest more. And then, of course, those are all stupid excuses. We got to find what's next and what's another way. And how do we keep doing the kind of things we did that have been so successful, but find new ways to apply it when you're not in the office together 5 days a week?
That is a challenge, building culture and maintaining it across many different locations.
I think the flip side to all that is that anybody that's hungry and wants to learn has no excuse, I mean, and so then maybe you shouldn't have an excuse to not be hungry either. But it never ends, and there's so much to see and learn.
There are a few things from my conversation with Tim that I want to take a special emphasis on as we wrap up this episode. First, I want to go back in time when he was a new CEO, and he described that he was struggling to have trusting relationships with the people that he was leading, and that his predecessor asked him this question: do you want to be the CEO, or do you just want to have the title? What a profound question. And in that, he's saying to Tim, you have to take ownership of this situation. In spite of the fact that you have been a relationship-driven guy in your past, and many people know you as somebody who's great at relationships, you have some relationships that are not awesome right now. And are you going to sit back and blame the other party? Oh, they just don't really know me. Or are you going to do something about it? Are you going to take responsibility for the fact that those relationships aren't as good as they need to be? And so I love that question from his predecessor. Do you want to be the CEO, or do you just want to have the title? Jocko Willink has a book called Extreme Ownership that references this idea. Dr. Henry Cloud calls it being ridiculously responsible. But in the end, when things aren't going well, if we really intend to actually be the leader, as opposed to just having the title, then we have to take on the lion's share of the responsibility for fixing anything that's not working, even if we might say, hey, it's not my fault, it's not my doing that it's not working. We still have to take on that responsibility. We still have to take ownership. And I love that question from his predecessor. Another thing that I think is worthy of some extra emphasis is you heard Tim talk about the different ways that he communicates with the organization. He mentioned video, email on desktop, email on phone. He talked about even bolding things and sentences in those emails. That might seem like a really subtle thing, but what I want to point out is, are you thinking about that? In the places where you lead, are you thinking so detailed about your communication that you think about what will this look like on a desktop computer versus what will it look like on a phone? To me, that screams of extreme intentionality by Tim and his leadership and how he communicates, and that he is willing to do a variety of different things that are not just simply convenient for him. One of the most important things that we can do as leaders is take responsibility for what our communication produces. We aren't good leaders when we say, hey, I put the communication out there, and if they don't get it, and if they don't move forward in the way that we need them to, then that's on them. That gets back to the ownership comment that I was making a little bit earlier. We have to take responsibility for the end result. It is never enough to put communication out into the world. If we're going to be great leaders, we have to have the mentality of, how is this communication going to land? Are they going to hear the message clearly? Are they going to hear it accurately? Are they going to take the actions that we need them to based on this communication? And so you heard in Tim great intentionality and some creativity as well in how he thinks about communication. So is that something you're doing? I hope that it is. If it isn't, I encourage you to be more intentional in how you think about communicating with your team. Finally, Tim told a story about addressing a very personal worldview issue with one of his employees, David. And that issue was perfectionism. Now, I can really relate to this story. I am hopefully a recovering perfectionist myself. But the thing I think that is so special about that story is not about the perfectionism itself, but it is that Tim was willing to go there. He was willing to have a conversation about something that was pretty personal about one of the folks that he was leading. He was willing to have a conversation about something about his personality that was holding him back in his career. And he even did it. This gets back to the communication point I was making a second ago. He even did it with David's wife present. If you caught the whole of that story, Tim went and did a financial calculation on how much David's perfectionism was going to cost him over the course of his career, and then shared that number not only with David, but with David's wife as they were having dinner. Now, some people might hear that story and say, hey, that's overstepping. But I'll tell you why it's not overstepping. It's not overstepping when the leader genuinely cares about the person they're delivering that message to. As Tim cares about David and David's wife and their family, he has, I might even say, a responsibility to communicate with David about how he sees this personality trait holding him back in his career and his life. And then he chose to communicate it. Yes, it was bold, but it was also very creative. Put the time in to think about, how can I communicate this to David in such a way that he's really going to hear it? And now, many years later, you notice David is still currently working for him. So David didn't run away. He took it to heart, and they have moved forward. So the bottom line of that is Tim was willing to go there. He was willing to engage with David on a very personal issue because he wanted what was best for David. And yes, that was also what was going to be best for the organization, but he was willing to go there. So that brings me to the question I want to leave you with today. As a leader, with regard to the people you're developing, are you willing to go there? Are you willing to have very personal conversations with them in order to help them grow and develop? This is Tim Spiker reminding you to be worth following and to follow us wherever you get your podcasts. If you've heard something valuable today, please share our podcast with your friends and colleagues. And if you're up for it, leave us a 5-star review.